Hi everyone.
Hi.
How's everyone doing? Good. All right, great. Nice to be here. I am going to talk about supply chains, so I entitled this talk Data Mining Data. Get it? That's enough of that. All right, so I have a startup started in Cambridge, now it's in New York, called Sourcemap. We specialize in something very unique, which is supply chain mapping, which means literally putting supply chains on a map, but it's something very new, and I'll show you why. It's a combination of a data mining challenge, a social networking challenge, and a challenge of changing the way business is done. And I'm going to try to explain why. Do you guys, okay, so there's an important day for me because I got my degree in the spring of 2011, and the way that I became an entrepreneur and not an academic was because of something that happened on March 11th, 2011, which, if you might know, was the tsunami that hit the Japanese coast. And until that day, I was just a guy who was publishing maps of where things come from for public benefit. On that day, a series of things happened that changed the way that supply chains are thought of all over the world. Although most people don't think about supply chains ever. So this is what happened. This is a little gizmo called an oxygen sensor, which measures the oxygen going into an engine for a car. So every engine in the world has one of these little gizmos. It's only worth like a couple of bucks. On that day, the factory that makes almost all those oxygen sensors in the world was just wiped away. And it's not uncommon these days for one factory to make all of something. Like there's one factory in China that makes all the vitamin B in the world, for example. And this factory was Hitachi factory that happened to make all the oxygen sensors. A couple of weeks later, this plant in Shreveport, this Ford, I think, plant, just shut down. Because even though the truck is made of a lot of stuff, you can't roll one truck off the assembly line without that little gizmo. And so what started to happen was people started to wonder, well, I wonder where that oxygen sensor comes from because we're not getting it at receiving anymore. And on March 24th, so that's 13 days later, the New York Times runs an article saying, hey, these plants seem to be running out of these parts. And so I usually have to motivate people to think like supply chains are underexplored, undermapped. But when you take 13 days to find out that you're running out of a part because of a tsunami, you have to imagine that something's wrong. When Hitachi can't supply GM and Ford and Volkswagen and Mercedes, that they wouldn't know that the minute it happened, right? I mean, if your store that you buy food from was wiped off the face of the earth, you would know right away. That's a good question. Was Hitachi directly supplying all the auto manufacturers? And in fact, it was. But it was a Hitachi distributor, which means a Hitachi sales rep in the local town. And we run into that quite a bit these days. So not by coincidence, like a month later, Sourcemap became a company because all of a sudden manufacturers are asking us for help with this. Now, if you are into data mining, there's a lot of exciting potential here because imagine these little dollar parts that get washed away and then millions and hundreds of millions of dollars of manufactured goods can't roll off the line, so you have a really clear return on investment just for being the first to find out that something might have influenced you. The problem is that that's not as easy as it would seem. And you'll see these stories in the news all the time, but almost every year China will block exports of rare earth metals. These are the metals that make semiconductors possible to Japan because they'll do the thing where they worship at the shrine and it's very offensive. And but it doesn't take much data mining to find out that China has all of them. So you don't really want to cause hostility. Other things that happen that are very critical is relationships between pricing and materials. There was a drug called Heparin that in 2011, again, this is when I started the company, was adulterated. And it turns out heparin is an anticoagulant for hemophiliacs, or it's a coagulant for hemophiliacs, and it's made with pork, some sort of pork product. And again, these are very like layered things, but the price of heparin never changed, the price of pork tripled in China that year. And someone who was looking at the market would have said, well, that's weird. Why would something that was made of pork not change price when the raw material tripled? And in fact, what happened is they substituted it with something else, and not a small number of people died. These news also help you forecast technology, or they help you forecast where things are going. Not long later, 2011 was really the reason that Sourcemap exists. A part of Thailand flooded severely. Turns out every single hard drive factory in the world was there. Not everyone, like 80% of them. Very strange. This flood wiped out all of the world's ability to produce those old spinning hard drives. It's not coincidental that computers are this thick now, because about a month later, solid-state drives were the only things left on the market. They were very expensive. Computers bumped in price. And you could basically see the death of one technology and the growth of another just based on that flood. So, oh yeah, does anyone know the connection between Ebola and chocolate? All of the chocolate in the world comes from West Africa. Yeah, sorry, I'll move into that later. These days, so I went to the Media Lab, and one of the groups I was with was called the Civic Media Group. And the Civic Media Group is run by a guy who is quite inspiring to me, Ethan Zuckerman. He wrote a book a couple years ago called Rewire. And the thesis was, you can get water to drink from Fiji, but you probably don't know anything else about Fiji. Isn't that amazing that we can actually ship things from the other end of the earth, but we don't know the people who live there? And of course, Fiji, it turns out, has been involved in like all sorts of military coups for the last 10 years. And so the fact that we have these supply chains that move goods but not information is basically the heart of the problem. Now the coolest thing in supply chains today is Amazon. In fact, they're what makes people think supply chains are pretty cool, because Amazon has this thing which is like, they know you're going to need toilet paper before you do, and so they stock up the nearest distribution center, and then you order and they ship to you. And that's called predictive analytics in supply chain. It's actually not a big deal. That's really the last leg of distribution. It's from a DC, a distribution center, to your house. And all you need to do is know what the demand is at various times of year for various types of goods, and you make sure the goods move into the right place at the right time. And this is the kind of software that's always been around to do that. It basically looks like little starbursts. You have a distribution center and customers. And it's a linear optimization algorithm. And in fact, when we started mapping company supply chains, this is what they would say, is my supply chain. They would say, I have a factory, I have suppliers, and I have distribution centers. And that is literally what, this actually took 2 years to get out of one company. But this is literally what a company's supply chain was. It was basically a list of receipts. They know about as much about it as you do about your Amazon sort of purchasing history. And in fact, this is most likely what a supply chain looks like in terms of number of nodes and links in the chain, if you think about the suppliers, and then the customer. So you end up with what is actually, for me, kind of beautiful. It's really a social network. It's a social network that's very regulated because it follows the rules of the conservation of mass. That the goods have to flow from one thing to another. It connects pretty much everyone on the planet through transactions. So you're connected to a cocoa farmer in West Africa, and you're connected to a rare earth metals miner in the Congo by virtue of what you have in your pocket or what you had for lunch. And I think that's really great. Obviously, there's other issues with that, and we can get into that later. The truth of it is, from a quantitative point of view, it's not actually big data. It's just large data. But a typical sort of toothpaste manufacturer will have 1,000 suppliers. An automotive one will go into the hundreds of thousands. And food is kind of amazing because there will be millions of people involved in just the pepper that goes on top of this thing. Pretty amazing. Now, I'm really inspired by the work of this artist, Mark Lombardi. Mark Lombardi died in 2000. He would draw these very painstaking sort of pencil network models of influence and causality and conspiracy. And what I loved about these things was, well, back then, these were hand-drawn. This is a really famous one he drew in 1999. that actually connects George W. Bush, governor of Texas, 3 links away from Osama bin Laden through the oil interests. Now, he died in 2000. He actually didn't even know what happened, ultimately. And it was always suspected he died under weird circumstances. I like this guy. So, at the Media Lab in 2009, we released a website. The idea was we would get around all of these issues and others by letting anyone publish the story of any product down to the raw materials. And all it involved was a mapping service where you would draw dots and lines, and you would assign materials to those dots. And it was really a demo in the classic sense of what we did with Media. It worked, but it was meant more of a provocation than an actual thing. And in fact, it worked, right? Because we demoed this, and manufacturers thought it was insane. Because it turns out until then, their purchasing systems didn't store address data. So they may have bought directly from Hitachi, but they wouldn't have known. They would have only had the invoice and the remit to. And we released that, and right away, a couple of big CPGs came in and said, well, we don't want this thing to happen to us like it did to the automotive industry. So can you at least get us this little diagram that says, you know, click on a point, tell me who's there, what they do. Do I own them? Do I work for them? Do they work for me? These kinds of questions. So what we've been doing basically for the last 5 years is helping hold a mirror up to operations of a company. Now, it looks really simple when you draw it kind of in a cartoonish way, and that was the intent. The intent was to make it unintimidating. Those numbers be dollars, and can we find out how much money we're wasting or we have at risk? And so we immediately went to that side of things because I had a small payroll to maintain, and what we would do is basically let them see for the first time that they weren't buying from Hitachi in San Francisco. Hitachi in San Francisco was only the sales rep, and actually that box said the port of entry and the port of exit was out of Osaka, and so you could trace the product all the way back. And not only could you trace it, but you knew how much inventory was in the chain, and you knew how much money that was worth. And you knew if that was the only thing you were sourcing from them, how much money would hold you up if something happened. And so we went down this sort of bifurcated path, which we still do, actually. One side is helping companies compete by finding out who their suppliers are. The other side is helping companies come clean by disclosing who their suppliers are. So this is the part about data mining. I'm not actually a programmer. I'm a designer. It turns out sometimes you need a designed sort of provocation to get people to then pay for data mining. Turns out that if you try to map a supply chain from supply chain data, it's almost impossible. In fact, nobody really does it. And that's because imagine that all you have is a pile of all the receipts of your company. Because that's what an enterprise resource planning system effectively is. It's transaction records. If you took all the things you bought on Amazon and tried to map your supply chain as a human being, you would not be able to. That's exactly what you get when you try to map from ERP. So you would do something like we would do this. Take all these tables, come up with some noodly way to infer that this raw material you bought on that day probably was used in this finished good that you sold on this other day 6 months later. And you would end up with this kind of network model, which is what you saw, which is actually an aggregate of every single purchase order, every single shipment, and every single process log of every single factory, so that we would know that something arrived one day, but then 4 months later it left in this new form. And if you consider that most supply chains have 10 or 20 tiers, again, it's not big data. I mean, we hardly ever get more than a gig a day from a single client, but it is a lot of data. And it's a lot of data that has to be tied together based on everybody uses a different part number, site number, and company identifier. So all of that lookup happens, and that's how we get to where we get today. But that's not the hard part. And I know you guys can probably figure out how to take a bunch of transactions and make a network model out of it. The hard part is when those people don't even officially do business with each other. And that's the challenge with the tsunami. Do you guys recognize this picture? This is always a killer in New York. This was when Sandy flooded everywhere below 14th Street. As you can see, the blackout. Actually, our new headquarters is good rent. What happened was, as you know, a saltwater wave washed over Lower Manhattan, burned out a lot of the electronic infrastructure and fuel infrastructure and heating infrastructure. Luckily, it was really warm that weekend in October 2012. And this is what people don't know. The city ran out of gasoline. There's a pipeline from Houston, 1,600-mile long pipeline, to 2 pipelines 1 yard diameter each that feed gasoline straight from Houston into Brooklyn continuously. Because the city eats 500,000 barrels a day for the airports, for the police cars, and the ambulances, and the taxis. And it turns out if you cut that supply off, there are actually something like 25 million barrels sitting across the Hudson in those tanks. But the pipe wasn't working, so those 25 million barrels sat there, and the city went through its supply, which as it turns out was just squirreled away in underground tanks in individual gas stations and police stations. And so what happened was the city was trying to repair services, had no gas, and if you have no gas, you can't get food, medicine, you can't repair electrical services, you can't resume manufacturing. You basically have an entire global economy that runs on refined petroleum. And those pumps were washed away. I mean, that pipeline didn't come back for weeks. So after about 6 days, they got really worried at the city hall. And it turns out the only people they knew who might have an idea of how to get gas was not the Office of Emergency Management, which is supposed to know. It was the Economic Development Corporation. They had a little Rolodex of businesses in New York City. And so they started calling gas stations one after another to see who had gas. Because, you had to get the ambulances and police vehicles. You believe me? Sound reasonable? I didn't believe it for a long time. It'll come out in the book sometime. So what happened is 7 days later, they finally went up the chain far enough to find one of the only 3 companies that actually supplies gas into the New York City area, Hess, which is now out of business. And they were able to commandeer a train to carry gas from upstate New York, which is one of the few places there's a refinery that can feed the city without having to go through the pipeline. They had to use a train because one of the key bridges that barges would have gone under to feed the refinery couldn't open because its machines had also been broken. And so you ended up with this was 2 years later we did this project for the Economic Development Corporation of New York City, which was to find out just how little they know, because it's not a supply chain. It is every business in the city, every mom and pop gas station that happens to buy and sell gas. And you have to go all the way up the chain to find out who has it, and then you have to plead that person to please get you some gas when things go wrong. So we discovered that there's one kind of data mining, which is enterprise, which is doable, kind of painful. Then there's another kind, which is crowdsourcing. You have to actually get all of the businesses in a supply chain, in an industry, in a commodity, to be willing to tell you who they buy from and who they sell to. Otherwise, you can't draw the end-to-end, and if you miss a link or if you miss a piece of data, you're actually out of raw material, which in this case is the mother of all raw materials, so to speak. This is back to West Africa, and then we'll wrap up. Who likes chocolate? Did you know that we have a cocoa shortage? We've had a shortage. Supply has not met demand for the last 3 years. And it is anticipated that it will just keep on needing it less and less. So the price has tripled in the last 2 years. You might not know, they might have just made the chocolate bar thinner. But soon you'll find out. And this is basically what was projected 2 years ago, and it's been holding true. Mostly has to do with new consumption, but it also has to do with one other thing, which is also about data. Global warming is finally starting to be felt in a big way in agricultural production. It's having a major impact, especially in equatorial regions and in flood-prone and drought-prone regions. And all of the cocoa in the world comes from that little, well, all of it, 70% of it, comes from that little area right there, which happens to be 2 degrees north of the equator. That green belt in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire is that 70% of the cocoa, and the projections now are that it will be like that by 2050 because of a 1 degree rise. It's all very low-lying equatorial growing area, so 1 degree rise means it dries up. And you go from there to there. So nowadays, the commodities buyers are probably the most advanced in terms of supply chain mapping. They don't know exactly which products go into which companies, but they know which parts of the world make what. And based on that, they do a lot of hedging on these things. I won't go into that. Luckily, a friend of mine who was at Sloan in 2010, getting her MBA, ended up working at Mars. And then a few years later, she called and said, hey, you guys are always crowdsourcing supply chain data. Can you guys crowdsource our supply chain data? Can you help Mars Chocolate find out where the farmers are, how they live, and what's going on in farms? And so we built a little version of our social network for Mars, which was effectively to say, okay, for years you've been buying cocoa from the Port of Elizabeth or the Port of Philadelphia, from one of the big cocoa trading companies. You've never had a relationship with the farmer. And if the farmers are having trouble because of climate change or because of various social or environmental issues, you don't know because you don't actually deal with them. And this is kind of what the big punchline is. If you get companies to worry about their supply chain, they all of a sudden have to engage with their second and third and fourth tier suppliers, and they'll want to engage because it's strategic, especially when you're selling chocolate and it's made of cocoa and all the cocoa in the world comes from there. And so this social network, which is active now in 3 countries, is basically pulling in data about farming practices. It's pulling in data about access to education, healthcare, infrastructure, various social projects. So the aim is to bring data into places where it never was, and to see if a company wants to improve production, how do they do it in such a remote way? And do they do it through fertilizer access or pesticide or training or schooling? And that's what ultimately this all comes down to, is very simple dashboards. All that data, it's about a gig per country per year. So it's not a huge amount of data. Ultimately, it tallies up to see how many people can grow how much and make how much in this supply chain. And that's, believe it or not, kind of revolutionary. You'll never see that information publicly. And what I showed you was fake. The happy ending of the talk is, if you build it, they will come. And the good about supply chain mapping is now it has become expected of companies. So whether they have to data mine, whether they have to send people with tablets into the forest to interview farmers, whether they have to crowdsource it from Chinese suppliers, the fact that it is now becoming normal for a company to publish its supply chain means that they have to start doing it for one reason or another. And they are doing it. This was actually back in 2012, Chiquita logged in and just published their banana supply chain, which we never saw coming. A couple summers ago, Stonyfield published their Sourcemap, working with us. Actually, yesterday, Honest Tea published its Sourcemap, but they were just copyright infringing. They actually didn't work with us on it at all. This gets much more interesting for me when it gets into what I call a real supply chain. This is a fraction of a cell phone. You can't even use it. Lots of little dots and lines. This is the cell phone. These are the first tier sort of sub-assemblies, the boards, the second tier, third tier, fourth tier. Sometimes they get down to the metals and the sub-components. When you get into that, this is a company called Fairphone out of Holland. They have built an entire brand out of being transparent and trying to account for every step in the manufacturing and raw material sourcing of their Android phone. And when you get into those, you get into some pretty cool new ways of doing business and new business models that actually from the beginning rely on accountability and direct engagement with the supply chain, as opposed to it being a patch, as opposed to being something that gets done after the fact. They do it as a matter of being and as a matter of course. This is the most exciting and the last thing I'll show you that we're doing now, which is kind of, for me, the holy grail, which is traceability. Traceability actually means visibility into every single transaction in the supply chain. It's that social network I talked about. And it doesn't mean you'll get to find out how much a farmer makes or how much an intermediary makes. That would actually break a lot of trade laws. It means that everybody in the chain got a receipt. A receipt is not something that everyone who does business in the world actually is entitled to. In fact, a lot of the problems, I think, are due to lack of accountability. This is in Portuguese, but basically what they're doing is they've got cooperatives in the Amazon using tablets to register every contract, every receipt, take a picture of the contract, take a picture of the producer, ensure that when you buy a product in Sao Paulo or Rio, you're able to then enter in the barcode and find out exactly which producers fed into that supply chain on that day. It's all very nice. It's all very good storytelling. It's probably only, 3 to 5% of consumers will actually scan the barcode, but it doesn't matter. Because the barcode means that traceability is there, the accountability is there. We know that every transaction is conducted fairly. This is the cool part. That wasn't the cool part. Cool part is Global Forest Watch. Has anyone heard of this? If Google uses its satellites now, and as a byproduct, they do a leaf cover difference analysis on infrared. So they can tell you month to month where there's less leaf cover and more everywhere on Earth. And so we can do things like take certification, which is kind of onerous and somewhat paternalistic, and we can replace it with something where people manage their own supply chains. They manage the price that they get at market for things. And then you can verify that it did or did not contribute to deforestation because you can actually compare it with the pixels that were captured that month. So you don't have to trust someone's stamp of certification. You can actually look at real data and know yes or no, this was clean. This was a good and ethical product that supported a good and ethical company. That's it.